A man is cutting cypress wood on a flat plain in ancient Mesopotamia. The sky above him is clear. It has always been clear. In his entire lifetime, and he has lived a long time, he has never seen water fall from the sky. No one has. The ground is watered by mist that rises before dawn and soaks back into the earth by mid-morning. That is how it has always worked. That is the only world this man has ever known. And yet he is building a boat. Not a small boat, a vessel 300 cubits long, roughly the length of 1.5 football fields. He is coating the inside and outside with pitch. He is cutting rooms into it. He is building it on dry ground, far from any river, far from any sea. His neighbors watch from a distance. Some of them laugh. Some of them go quiet in a way that is worse than laughing. His name is Noah. And we will come back to him because of all the names in the chapter we are about to spend the next 30 minutes inside. And there are many names, some famous, some forgotten, some with no names at all. Noah's entry may be the most quietly devastating, not because of what he built, because of what the writer says his faith did to everyone around him. We will get to that. But not yet. The chapter is Hebrews 11. And if you have spent any time in a church, you have probably heard it called the Hall of Faith, a trophy room, a highlight reel of the Bible's greatest hits. Abraham, Moses, David, Rahab, spiritual athletes posing with their trophies. Here is what I want to tell you before we read a single verse. This is not a chapter about winners. This is not a chapter about people who got what they prayed for. This is not a hall of fame. It is something far stranger and far more important than that, because if you read this chapter slowly, if you follow every name to its ending, you will find something that should stop you cold. Most of these people died before the promise arrived. Some of them were tortured. Some were sawn in two. Some wandered in deserts wearing the skins of dead animals because they had nothing else. And the writer of Hebrews looks at every single one of them and says, "These are the heroes." That is not a trophy room. That is a different kind of chapter entirely. And it may be the most important one in the Bible. Before we get to Abraham and Moses and the names you already know, the writer of Hebrews starts somewhere most people don't expect. He starts with a murder. The very first name in the Hall of Faith is Abel, Adam's second son, a shepherd, and the writer gives him exactly one sentence. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous. That is all. One sentence, one act. And then Abel is dead. Here is what the text does not tell you, but what you already know if you have read Genesis. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, the best animal, not the leftover. He did not bring what was convenient. He brought what cost him something, and God looked at it with favor. And Cain, whose offering the text says God did not regard, killed his brother, probably within the same week. The very first hero of faith in this chapter is also the very first martyr in the Bible. Think about what that means for a moment. If you came to Hebrews 11 looking for evidence that faith leads to blessing, that obedience leads to safety, that doing the right thing leads to a good outcome, the writer ends that argument in the first sentence. Abel obeyed. Abel brought his best. Abel pleased God. And Abel was dead before the chapter is 2 sentences old. Now here is what most people miss. The writer does not stop at Abel's death. He says something stranger. He being dead yet speaketh. Abel is gone. His body is in the ground. And yet something about his act, something about the quality of his offering, the weight of his trust, is still speaking. The Greek word for faith used here, and repeated 40 times throughout the letter to the Hebrews, is pistis. It does not mean passive belief. It does not mean sitting quietly and hoping something works out. Pistis means active trust, faithfulness enacted, not just felt. It is closer to the English word faithfulness than the word belief. Abel's pistis outlived Abel. The second name is Enoch. If Abel is the chapter's first shadow, Enoch is its first mystery. The writer says he was translated that he should not see death, which is the writer's elegant way of saying that Enoch simply did not die. He walked with God for 300 years. And then one day, he was not. The Hebrew text in Genesis says God took him. He did not get sick. He did not grow old and fade. He was here, and then he was somewhere else, and the ground where he stood was empty. The writer of Hebrews adds one detail that Genesis does not emphasize. Before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And then immediately, as if the writer knows exactly what question is forming in your mind. He says this: without faith it is impossible to please him. Not difficult, not unlikely. Impossible, that word should land with some weight. The writer is not saying faith makes things easier. He is not saying faith improves your odds. He is saying there is no other currency. There is no other way into that sentence. He pleased God, except through pistis, active trust enacted in the dark. Now look at what the writer has just done in two names. He has placed a murder victim and a man who skipped death entirely side by side in the same paragraph. Abel, who obeyed and was killed for it. Enoch, who walked faithfully and was taken before death could touch him. Two completely different outcomes. Two completely different endings. And the writer calls them both heroes of faith, without blinking, without explaining the difference, without apologizing for the fact that one of them suffered and one of them didn't. That is not an accident. That is the entire argument of the chapter compressed into two names. Faith does not guarantee the outcome. Faith is not a formula you apply to get a specific result. Faith is the act of trusting the character of God, regardless of what the result turns out to be. Abel trusted. He died. Enoch trusted. He didn't. And both of them, the dead man and the man who never died, are in the same hall. Stay with me, because it goes deeper. Now we come back to the man on the flat plain, Noah. The writer of Hebrews gives him one of the longer entries in the chapter. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. 4 clauses, 4 movements, and the one that should stop you is the third one. He condemned the world, not saved it, not warned it, condemned it. The same act of obedience that put 8 people inside a boat passed judgment on everyone outside it. We will come back to that sentence. I told you we would. But first, I want you to see something about the Greek word translated substance in verse 1, the thesis verse of the entire chapter. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The Greek word is hypostasis. And in the legal papyri of the ancient world, the documents that Greek-speaking people used in everyday commerce and law, hypostasis was the word for a title deed, a document proving ownership of property not yet in your possession. If you purchased a piece of land and the transaction was recorded, but you had not yet traveled to stand on that land, the hypostasis was the proof you owned it. The document in your hand was the legal evidence of a reality you had not yet experienced. That is what the writer says faith is, not a feeling, not optimism, not positive thinking, a title deed. Legal proof of ownership for a promise not yet delivered. Noah held a title deed for a world he had never seen, a world where water fell from the sky, where everything he knew would be underwater, where 8 people in a wooden vessel would be the only living thread connecting the old world to the new one. He had never seen rain. He built for 120 years anyway. He held his hypostasis, and he kept cutting cypress wood. And this is where it gets remarkable, because the next name is Abraham. And Abraham's story makes Noah's look almost straightforward. God speaks to a man in Ur of the Chaldees, a sophisticated city, a center of civilization, a place of ziggurat temples built to honor the moon god Nana. Abraham is 75 years old. He has spent his entire life in this city. He has a household, servants, flocks, a wife named Sarai who is 65 years old and has never been able to have children. And God says to him, "Leave. Leave your country, your people, your father's house. Go to a land I will show you." There is no map. There is no destination named. There is only the instruction to go, and the promise that God will show him where when he gets there. And the writer of Hebrews says Abraham went out, not knowing where he was going. He arrives in Canaan, and he lives there for 100 years, in tents, not a house. Tents. He is a nomad on land promised to him by God, and the only piece of that land he ever legally owns is a burial plot he purchases from a Hittite man named Ephron to bury his wife Sarah. 400 shekels of silver for a cave and a field. That is his entire land, holding in the promised land, a tomb. He dies at 175 years old, having spent a century as a stranger on his own inheritance. And then there is Sarah. The writer names her. In a first-century document, written to a Jewish audience, steeped in a tradition that rarely placed women at the center of theological argument, The writer of Hebrews looks at this 90-year-old woman who laughed when the angel told her she would have a son, who had been called barren her entire life, whose body the text describes with unflinching honesty as good as dead, and names her a hero of faith. She judged God faithful. That is all the writer says. She looked at an impossible promise and decided the one who made it was trustworthy, and a nation was born from a woman who laughed. Now here is the verse that pivots the entire chapter. Verse 13. Read it slowly. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, not Abel, not Enoch. Well, Enoch didn't die, but he never saw Israel either. Not Noah, who stepped off the ark onto a wrecked and waterlogged world. Not Abraham, who died in a tent on land that belonged to him only on paper. Not Sarah, who held her son for perhaps 30 years before the text moves on and she is gone. None of them received what was promised, they saw it. From a distance. Like a man standing on a shoreline watching a light on the far side of a dark sea. Real, visible, but unreachable before the night runs out. They saw the promises. They were persuaded of them. They died, reaching towards something they never touched. And the writer calls this faith. Let me pause here for just a moment, because we are halfway through this chapter and a pattern has already emerged that I do not want you to miss. Every name we have looked at so far, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, every single one of them trusted God for something they could not see, could not prove, and in most cases never received in their lifetime. That is not a coincidence. That is the argument the writer is building. We still have Moses to look at. We still have Rahab. We still have the unnamed ones, and they are the ones who may shake you the most. If this is resonating with you, subscribe so you don't miss the second half, and drop a comment. Which name so far has hit you the hardest, and why? I read everyone. Now, back to the chapter. There is a woman in this chapter who does not get named. The writer of Hebrews describes her act without giving her name. But if you know your Old Testament, you know exactly who she is. Numbers chapter 26, verse 59 gives her name, Jochebed. She is the mother of Moses, and what she does in the second chapter of Exodus is one of the most quietly devastating acts of faith in the entire Bible. Pharaoh has issued an order. Every Hebrew boy born in Egypt is to be thrown into the Nile. Jochebed gives birth to a son. She looks at him. The text says she saw that he was a beautiful child, though I think any mother reading this knows she would have hidden him regardless. And she hides him for 3 months. She feeds him in secret. She muffles his crying. She keeps him alive by sheer will and daily terror. And then she cannot hide him anymore. So she builds a basket. She waterproofs it with tar and pitch, the same materials Noah used on the ark, which is not an accident. She places her son inside it. She carries him to the edge of the Nile. And she lets go. Here is the part nobody tells you. The Hebrew word used for that basket in Exodus chapter 2 is teva. It is the exact same word used for Noah's ark. Jochebed is not placing her son in a basket. She is placing him in an ark. She is doing for one child what Noah did for the world. She is trusting that the vessel she built, on the water she fears, carrying the thing she loves most, will be enough. And then she stands on the bank and watches it float away. I want you to think about that moment. Not as a Bible story, as a human moment. You have prepared everything you can prepare. You have waterproofed every seam you can waterproof. You have done every single thing within your power to do. And now the current is taking it, taking him, and your hands are empty, and the river does not care about your prayers. And the basket is getting smaller, and there is nothing left to do but trust. Every parent who has ever driven home from a college drop-off knows that bank. Every person who has ever walked out of a hospital room knowing they could not fix what was happening inside it knows that bank. Every human being who has ever done everything they could do and then had to open their hands and release. You have stood where Jochebed stood, on the edge of the water, watching the ark float away, with nothing left but faith. The writer of Hebrews calls that moment the definition of pistis. Now, the child in the basket grows up, Moses, Prince of Egypt, adopted grandson of Pharaoh, educated in the finest schools of the ancient world, trained in its military, positioned for a life of extraordinary comfort and extraordinary power. And the writer of Hebrews says that Moses, when he was grown, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He walked away from the palace, voluntarily. He chose poverty with God's people over luxury without them. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews, describes Moses as a military commander of remarkable ability, a man who had every reason and every resource to remain exactly where he was. He left anyway. He led 2 million people through a desert for 40 years. He climbed a mountain called Nebo, and God showed him the land, the whole land, from Gilead to the Mediterranean, and Moses looked at it. And then Moses died, on the mountain, looking at a promise he never entered. And then there is Rahab. If Moses stretches your understanding of who belongs in this chapter, Rahab breaks it entirely. She is a Canaanite woman, a prostitute in the city of Jericho. She is outside every covenant God has made with Israel. She has no bloodline, no heritage, no claim. And yet here is what she does. She hears the stories, the Red Sea, the Jordan, the kings that fell. She hears what God has done for a people she does not belong to, and she believes it. She has never seen a miracle. She has only heard about them. And she decides, on the basis of secondhand reports about a God she has no personal history with, that he is real and that he wins. She hides 2 Israelite spies in her house on the city wall. She lies to the soldiers who come looking for them. She negotiates, shrewdly, specifically, with remarkable clarity, for the safety of her entire family. And she ties a scarlet thread in her window and waits. The walls of Jericho fall. Every wall except the section where a scarlet thread hangs in a window. This is not a chapter about people who were qualified. This is not a chapter about people who had the right background, the right bloodline, the right profession, the right gender, the right history with God. This is not a chapter about insiders. It checks one thing only. Did you trust him? Rahab trusted him. And her name sits in this chapter beside Abraham and Moses without apology. Now the writer does something I have never seen any other biblical author do. He runs out of time, not out of material, not out of names. He says it himself, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. He lists 6 names in a single breath and then stops listing. Not because the hall of faith is empty, because it is too full, because there are too many, because if he told every story the scroll would never end. So he switches from names to descriptions, and this is where the chapter goes somewhere. Most Sunday morning readings do not follow it. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. That is verse 33 and 34. Those are the victories. The lions stopped, the fires quenched, the armies turned back. Those are the verses that get printed on coffee mugs and quoted in sermons about breakthrough and victory, and God coming through at the last moment. Now, read what comes next. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. And they wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Stay with me. Read that again. Slowly, sawn asunder. That is not a metaphor. That is a method of execution. Jewish tradition records that the prophet Isaiah was killed this way, placed inside a hollow log and cut in 2 with a saw. Stoned, imprisoned, wandering in animal skins because they had no clothes, living in caves because they had no homes, destitute, afflicted, tormented. And the writer pauses in the middle of that list, in the middle of the hunger and the cold and the execution and the caves, and inserts 5 words. Of whom the world was not worthy. Not, these people were failures. Not, these people clearly did not have enough faith. Not, these people must have done something wrong. The world was not worthy of them. The people huddled in caves in animal skins were not beneath the world. The world was beneath them. The church historian Eusebius, writing in his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, understood something about this passage that we often miss. He noted that the letter to the Hebrews was read by the earliest Christians not as a theological treatise, but as a survival document. A letter passed between communities of believers living under Nero's persecution, people who had watched their neighbors burned alive in Roman gardens to serve as human torches, people who had lost houses and family members, and their own freedom. They read this chapter not as ancient history, but as a mirror. The unnamed ones in sheepskins were not people from the distant past. They were people down the street. Eusebius called Hebrews 11 the stadium of the saints. Not a hall, a stadium, a place where athletes run in full view of a watching crowd. And then the writer says something that changes everything about what that stadium means. Now watch what happens next. He is about to name who is watching. The very first chapter of Hebrews 12 opens with one sentence that reframes everything we have just read. Therefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. A cloud of witnesses. The writer is not saying these people are watching from a distance the way you watch a movie. Passively, comfortably, uninvested. The Greek word for witnesses here is marties. It is the word from which we get the English word martyr. These are not spectators. They are people who testified with their lives. And they are watching. Abel, still speaking though dead. Enoch, translated but present. Abraham, still a stranger and a pilgrim but leaning forward. Sarah, who laughed and then believed. Moses, who saw the land from a mountain. The unnamed ones in sheepskins, who the world was not worthy of. They are watching you. Now I want to go back to Noah. I told you we would. The writer says Noah's faith condemned the world, not saved it, condemned it. And I want you to sit with how strange and how serious that is. Because we tend to read Noah as a rescue story. 8 people in a boat. The animals. The rainbow. God's promise never to flood the earth again. It is the first Bible story most children ever learn. It is painted on nursery walls. But the writer of Hebrews is not interested in the nursery version. He is interested in what Noah's obedience meant, not just for Noah, but for everyone around him. Noah built for 120 years. 120 years of cutting wood, coating pitch, loading animals, while his neighbors watched. 120 years of testimony. 120 years of a man with a title deed for a world that didn't exist yet, building proof of it on dry ground, and not one of his neighbors got on the boat. That is the condemnation. Not a verdict pronounced from a throne. A verdict produced by contrast. Noah's yes made everyone else's no visible. His faithfulness did not just save his family. It illuminated the choice every person around him was making every single day for 120 years. Faith is never neutral. It never exists in isolation. Every act of genuine trust in God says something about the people who are watching and choosing otherwise. Pay attention to this, because the writer is about to close the chapter with the most staggering sentence in it, and it is directed at you. Verse 39. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. Every name, Abel and Enoch, Noah and Abraham and Sarah, Moses and Jochebed and Rahab, the unnamed ones in the caves. Every single one of them, the writer says it plainly, without softening it, received not the promise. And then verse 40. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Read that again. That without us, without you, they should not be made perfect, complete. Whole, the hall of faith is not a closed exhibit. It is not a finished monument. The writer of Hebrews is saying something almost unbearable in its weight. That the story Abraham trusted, the promise Moses died looking at, the covenant Rahab tied a scarlet thread in her window to claim. That story is not finished. It has not reached its conclusion. And it will not reach its conclusion without the people who are still living inside it. Without you. I want you to think about Jochebed one more time. She built the basket. She waterproofed every seam. She carried her son to the water, and she placed him in the ark she made with her hands, and she let go. And she stood on the bank watching the current take him, with empty hands and no guarantees, trusting that the God who told her to build was also the God who would carry. You may be standing on that bank right now. The promise you were given that has not arrived yet. The prayer that has gone unanswered for longer than you thought you could bear. The thing you built in obedience that is now floating away from you on a river you cannot control. The land you were promised that you are still living next to in a tent. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not outside the story. You are in the chapter, the same chapter as Abraham, the same chapter as Moses, the same chapter as the unnamed ones in sheepskins of whom the world was not worthy, the same chapter as a prostitute from Jericho who tied a scarlet thread in a window and waited for walls to fall. The chapter is still open, and the cloud of witnesses, every one of them, is leaning forward. Before we close, I want to leave you with 3 things. The first is this. Hebrews 11 is not a chapter about people who got answers. It is a chapter about people who stayed faithful without them. Abel never saw justice. Abraham never owned the land. Moses never crossed the Jordan. The unnamed ones in the caves never came in from the cold, and every single one of them is in the hall, not because of what they received, but because of what they trusted. Faith, the writer says, is the title deed, not the delivery. The deed, the second, is more personal. If you are waiting right now, waiting for a promise that hasn't arrived, a prayer that hasn't been answered, a door that hasn't opened, you are not in the wrong story. You are not in a lesser version of the Christian life. You are standing exactly where Abraham stood, exactly where Moses stood, exactly where Jochebed stood on the bank of the Nile with empty hands. The waiting is not the absence of faith. In this chapter, the waiting is faith. And the third, and I want you to hear this clearly, the God of this chapter has not forgotten a single thing you have offered in the dark. Not the prayer whispered at 2 in the morning when no one else was awake. Not the obedience that cost you something and seemed to produce nothing. Not the basket you built and waterproofed and placed on the water and let go. Abel's offering is still speaking. 2,000 years later, it is still speaking. Yours is too. Which name in Hebrews 11 is sitting with you the most right now? And why? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The chapter is still being written. And you are in it.